Hello, today is Wednesday, February 7th, and welcome to episode 294 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI's Senior Fellow Lester Munson. I'm joined today by NSI's Deputy Executive Director, Jessica Jones, and my fellow Senior Fellow, Morgan Vigna. Today, we are talking about Francophone West Africa. There's a lot of developments in this region of the world. Senegal, which has been a very stable country, relatively speaking, in the region, just announced, the president, Macky Sall, just announced that he is postponing this month's presidential elections indefinitely. This is a major blow to those who care about democracy and human rights in West Africa. Another recent development is Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso all pulling out of the regional grouping known as ECOWAS, or the Economic Community of West African States. Also of note, there is a recent story in the Washington Post from late January about a Pentagon plan to train U.S. troops alongside the troops of those 3 countries, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and other countries that are either coup countries or have serious human rights abuses, such as Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. This Pentagon plan was evidently scrapped once complaints from Capitol Hill, specifically Senators Cardin and Elizabeth Warren. Cardin, let's remember, is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, complained about this plan to train U.S. troops alongside these troops of countries that no longer were democracies, that either had coups or other serious human rights abuses. Morgan, I want to go to you first. This has been, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the region, notably the Russian mercenary company Wagner Group playing a role in a lot of these countries. What is happening in West Africa, and how should we be thinking about it?
Right. So Wagner has an extended presence in Africa in particular. I mean, I think we all know they are most known for their work in the Central African Republic. More recently, they have saw West Africa as a huge opportunity, given the sort of democratic backsliding, the coups. You have all of these, new governments, so to speak, whether they're legitimate or not, is a different question. But you have these new leaders in place from Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, who have really rejected sort of the traditional international peacekeeping forces. We saw these 3 countries, recently decide to leave ECOWAS. Mali, for example, kicked out UN peacekeepers with MINUSMA. So there really is a rejection of international peacekeeping, and even from regional forces, for that matter. They still have a terrorist threat that they're facing from Islamic extremism within the region. They see Wagner as clearly effective in going after these terrorist elements that threaten the stability of the regime. And so as a result of that, regardless of whether, Wagner, commits mass atrocities and human rights abuses, they're effective at killing people and protecting international leaders. And so I think these African governments see an opportunity to solidify their control on power, and Wagner is certainly helping them do that.
Jones, I'm hoping you can comment on this Pentagon idea that U.S. troops should be training alongside some of these governments' military forces. Again, some of those military forces implicated in halting democracy or suspending democracy. They've engaged in coups or near coup-like activities. What are your thoughts about this Pentagon plan that seems to have been squashed by a couple of key senators?
Well, I think, to the conversation on the Wagner Group, I think, the U.S. is trying to figure out a policy where it's active in the region and building relationships with these new governments, but also is trying to balance that with the human rights records that are apparent in these countries. I mean, you've got, it's no surprise really that the 3 countries left ECOWAS. I mean, they were being sanctioned by the regional organization, and ECOWAS itself, I mean, it's a regional, integration. It started out as a regional economic integration movement, but there's also an African, free trade act itself. There's a lot of other things, and so it's kind of going beyond its gambit of economics into politics. And so I think we've talked a lot on the show about how the Biden administration and previous administrations have not come up with a coherent foreign policy when it comes to the African continent. At times it's bilateral, it's one-on-one, conversations instead of thinking strategically and long term about how to smartly deal with the region.
So, all right. So, Morgan, I kind of want to put it to you here on the tools in the toolbox for U.S. policymakers. It seems, I will disclose my strong bias here. It seems like the Pentagon is trying to figure out a creative way to get inside these governments, to get to know them a little bit better, to understand what their vulnerabilities are, what their strengths are, to get some U.S. troops in there to see on the ground what's happening. This doesn't seem like a terrible idea to me. And even though the congressional restrictions, which include a ban on military aid to coup governments and the fact that and a prohibition on the U.S. training units, military units in foreign countries that have human rights abuses, those seem like sensible policies. But those restrictions, it appears to me, are really kind of putting us in a corner about how we can deal with this very rapidly developing situation in West Africa. Just over the last couple of years, many coups in the region, the Wagner Group moving in and really playing a key role here, the U.S. and our Western European allies kind of being pushed out of capitals and not being as relevant as we used to be. And while it's true West Africa is not exactly the most critical strategic region in the world, it could become yet another vulnerable place where we're worried about global terrorist organizations, the predations of China, some of these other global concerns we have. It seems like we've got a vulnerability here. What do you were at the Pentagon in the last administration. What do you think of this kind of attempt to maybe make a difference in some small way in these countries?
Les, I mean, you're hitting on a perennial problem here that it's not new. I think it's certainly not new in sub-Saharan Africa. You're dealing with congressional restrictions around human rights, good governance, democracy, and you pit that against a very sort of realist mentality, right, in which you have U.S. security interests at stake in countries which, frankly, are undemocratic, right? This is not new. I think what we're seeing right now in West Africa is that it's all coming to head. We've seen this pattern of coups and undemocratic transitions of power in recent years, and we're starting to see this void, this gap open up, and Russia coming to fill that. And so, I think Congress needs to work very closely with the administration here on trying to find a way forward. I know that, Senators Cardin and Risch back in December actually introduced a resolution on Senegal. Clearly said the Senate has been tracking this for quite some time, and there needs to be a more robust sort of way forward and compromise between the administration and Congress on sort of how to address this, because right now it seems that they're really at loggerheads.
Jones, what are your thoughts here? How much should we be blaming France for these problems? This is Francophone West Africa, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, arguably. These are Francophone countries.
Yep.
France played a big role there. It was the colonial power. It had close ties with these countries through the period after the colonial era and as these countries became nation states. How much should we be blaming Paris for all of this?
Between you and Jamil, I know yours is 100%. I mean, I think there is undoubtedly, as you pointed out, the number of countries that are Francophone countries. And I think what you see also in the region is still obviously antagonism towards France and what are seen as kind of behind the scenes or in front of the scenes French movements to still retain or influence what's going on the ground in the region. And so you see when Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger left ECOWAS, you saw actually across the region like support for that, right? You really did. And so I think that you compare that and see that with the feeling, the anti-French feelings. So I don't want to blame them less. You won't get me on record saying that, but that can't be ignored for sure.
All right, that's a wrap, or as we might say in West Africa, c'est fini. Thanks so much to Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Friday, February 9th for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. Fault Lines is now on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.